We are live now.
Shall we go?
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Good evening to
Good
all the participants who
Good
have
evening.
joined this session today on the subject Scientific Temper and the Fight Against COVID, which is organized by the Pune Collective and the All India People's Science Network. On the occasion of the National Scientific Temper Day, which was observed yesterday, August 20th, all over the country. To begin with, let me briefly tell you about NSTD, National Scientific Temper Day, which is observed on August 20th, which is the anniversary of the martyrdom of Dr. Narendra Dabholkar 8 years back yesterday at the hands of right-wing communal terrorists. NSTD was chosen to be observed on the occasion of Dr. Dabholkar's martyrdom because Dr. Dabholkar himself was perhaps the most important proponent of scientific temper in the post-independence India. And I will very briefly mention why we have chosen Dr. Dabholkar as the icon of this movement. This year, NSTD is focusing on two issues. One is on promote astronomy, not astrology, and the other is on scientific temper in the fight against COVID. Perhaps many of you may not be knowing that Dr. Dabholkar has co-authored with Professor Narlikar, Ghatpande and Kunte, perhaps the most important paper which takes the bottom out of astrology. I will not talk more about that. This paper appeared in Current Science in 2009. It has demolished the claim of astrology to being scientific in any way. How that happens, we can discuss some other time. But it's not just that. Dr. Dabholkar also has given perhaps the simplest and one of the best definitions of scientific temper in one sentence. He says in Marathi, it goes this way: Jevda purava, tevda vishwas. Only as much belief as there is evidence for. A very, very succinct definition of scientific temper. And as if that were not enough, there are two more very important contributions of Dr. Dabholkar to scientific temper, because Dr. Dabholkar was one of the few persons who actually took scientific temper to the common people, to the masses. There are many people who write on scientific temper, but as we all know, many of these writings are read only by the people within the scientific community. Dr. Dabholkar was different. He took scientific temper to the masses. In many ways, he was the pioneer of what we may call the universalization of scientific temper. Now, universalization of scientific temper is mandated by our constitution. I will very briefly say why. Well, firstly, because it is there as a fundamental duty of every Indian citizen in Article 51AH, that it is the fundamental duty to promote the scientific temper, spirit of inquiry, humanism. This is there as a part of our directive principles. It's not legally enforceable. But after the Right to Education Act, which made universalization of good quality education a legal right of every young Indian citizen, I think all of us will agree that good quality science education, which is now a legal right, must include scientific temper. So in that sense, now there is a mandate for universalization of scientific temper. And we also know that despite this, actually scientific temper is still rather a restricted attitude. And there is a great need to take up the task of universalization more seriously. Dr. Dabholkar was one person who showed how this can be done through his lectures and writings. There are numerous writings of Dr. Dabholkar on scientific temper, wonderful writings. I have had the honor of the privilege of translating two of his lectures, his writings, his essays into English, and thereafter they have been translated into almost all the Indian languages, all the languages from Malayalam and Tamil to Bangla and Assamese. The All India People's Science Network, because of this sterling contribution of Dr. Dabholkar, the All India People's Science Network, in its conference, which was held in 2018, adopted a resolution to observe a National Scientific Temper Day nationally on the 20th of August. And the first observation was 2018. We are in 2021. I must say that this year's observation, we are getting reports of what happened yesterday, show that NSTD has reached every part of India, every state of India, including states in the Northeast, states in the South, states in the North. I cannot think of a single state of India which has not observed in some way, somewhere, the NSTD. And to this, we have to thank all the organizations of the All India People's Science Network. There are many organizations in different states. Some states have more than one organization. There is Kerala Shastra Sahitya Parishad, Tamil Nadu Science Forum, Jana Vigyan Vedike. There is Paschim Bengal Vigyan Manch, Assam Science Society. Many organizations within AIPSN, and this time, perhaps as many organizations outside of AIPSN have contributed to the observance. And particularly, I must mention the Bharat Gyan Vigyan Samiti, which was instrumental in taking these programs this year to states like Nagaland and Mizoram for the first time since we started observing NSTD. The final word about scientific temper. It was defined, of course, various times, but it was defined particularly sharply in a conference which was held in 1981. And there, scientific temper was defined as accepting four propositions. The first is that the method of science is a valid method of approximating truth. The second is that the method of science has to be taken to all aspects of human experience and reality, not just the natural sciences, but also including the social sciences, also including economics, politics, culture. There are two more aspects of the scientific temper, which I will not mention here. I just mentioned these two because method of science is important. And the second is that science is now no longer seen as a subject like physics, chemistry, biology. Science is not something restricted to the natural sciences. Science is a method of understanding reality. It is an approach to truth. And science needs to also look at any problem comprehensively, particularly a problem like COVID, which is not just a medical problem. It is not just a natural science question about viruses and vaccinations and all the technical aspects about immunology. It is also about health systems. It is also about delivery. It's also about the social systems which are needed to fight COVID. So in that sense, COVID cannot be looked at just through the narrow, spectacles of medical science. It also has to be looked at through scientific temper, which examines the broader issues. And in the fight against COVID, the fight against pseudoscience, against fake data, wrong data, all these things are important. So with these opening comments, now I will invite our speakers to share their ideas with us. We have with us three main speakers. There is Professor Gagandeep Kang, there is Prabir Purkayastha, there is Dr. Hamid Dabholkar. We have two persons whom we will be felicitating today, who have played a very important role in calling a spade, in exposing pseudoscience. That is our colleagues from Manipur, Narendra and Kishore Chandra. We will be felicitating them on behalf of the Pune Collective and AIPSM. Professor Gagandeep Kang is a very eminent immunologist, microbiologist, a fellow of the Royal Society. And she has been, many of you have seen her on national TV speaking about COVID. She needs no further introduction. But I will just want to show a book that she has co-authored. It is called Till We Win, India's Fight Against the COVID-19 Pandemic. And it's authored by Dr. Chandrakant Laharia, Dr. Gagandeep Kang, and Dr. Randeep Guleria, three very eminent persons. We are very happy to have Dr. Kang to guide us today, share her ideas with us today. I invite Dr. Gagandeep Kang to start the presentation.
Thank you, Vivek, very much for inviting me to join you here today. And I thought what I would try to do is just start and tell some stories about my experiences, what we've been doing, and then come to COVID after that. In thinking about science, I can't imagine a life without science, but then I am a scientist and I have been one pretty much for my entire career. And I was lucky in a way. I had a father who was an engineer, and fortunately for me, he was a problem solver, which meant that the government would transfer him every 1.5, 2 or 3 years. And that meant changing a lot of schools and needing to do a fair amount of catching up with the curriculum of the new school and wherever I was. And essentially in those days, before there was a standardized curriculum at the younger level, it meant that summer holidays were spent studying, and we were all bookworms. So whether it is a book on calculus that my grandfather used in the 1920s, which was presented to me to study over the summer in the 1970s, or actually going down to markets in Calcutta to buy lenses to try and figure out how to set them up to focus on objects, it was a way of life. You were constantly learning, you were constantly trying to figure things out. And this held me, and I didn't realize that this was unusual. I didn't realize that this was something that was supposed to be practical classes in schools alone. Because when I became a doctor, lived on the CMC campus, we set up something for our children to do, which was a way of parents getting rid of their children on Saturday afternoons. It was called Saturday Club. for the children. And the idea was one set of parents will take about a dozen kids and keep them for an afternoon and find activities for them to do. So I had the opportunity of visiting Boston and visiting with some friends of mine whose daughter was in the 8th grade. So they said, our daughter is going for a science exhibition that her school is doing. I went there and my mind was blown by what 8th grade students in the US were doing. This child had a dog and the dog had developed tumors. What did she spend her summer doing? She went to the veterinarian, she took her dog to the vet removed the tumor, she took tissue samples from the tumor, went to the laboratories, and in Boston there are plenty of labs. But they welcomed students, and she sat there and she analyzed the mutations that made her dog have tumors. Now, and everywhere I looked in her 8th grade group, everyone had a project that was that fantastic. And I thought about it and I said, why can't our children be doing this? Our children, when they go to school, have a curriculum, but their exposure to science outside of school tends to be relatively limited. So in our Saturday club activities, my responsibility was always science. It was, how does a slope, the changing of a slope, how does it make things roll down faster? Can you actually do measurements accurately? Can you figure out, basically doing science exhibitions, getting children to design and do their own experiments? And when I was doing this for my very privileged children, I was also working in urban slum communities in Vellore. And in the urban slum communities, whenever, not just urban slum communities, but when we do research in India, we tend to have a very top-down attitude. And it's not just research, a lot of things that we do tend to be very hierarchical. I have made the decision and I will tell you what you will be doing. But for us, what we were doing was working with children and looking at children and how they developed. So the idea had started with working on diarrhea. I was trying to investigate causes of diarrhea, trying to sample children over time. But when you're sampling children from the time that they are born to 3 years of age, you begin to be following those children and seeing how they develop, seeing how families are interacting with their children, what they're doing. Very quickly, we realized that all of our children were not growing the same, and it wasn't the science that we were doing that could tell us what was happening. So we went from studying diarrhea to studying nutrition, to studying environments, to studying all the factors that led to the development of children. Very quickly figured out that essentially it's complicated. Probably the biggest drivers are the size of a child when it's born. So low birth weight children have issues. And then the next most important factor is the education of a mother, and in a lot of how a child develops has to do with how much education a mother has received. Fathers matter, but not as much as mothers do. So we have now followed up this original cohort of children that I started with. We have followed them up for 20 years. And over time, we have tried to figure out what's going on, how are these children growing. And when we started to look at growth, we figured out that it wasn't just physical growth that was important, it was mental growth as well. To cut 20 years of research short, I can tell you what I've learned. I've learned that if children don't grow well in early life, there is opportunity for recovery. But there are some children who do not recover. that stay small, that are stunted, and it is a continuum. But among the children who start getting damaged early and continue to be damaged over time, they actually lose IQ. And in order to be able to assess them, we did all the clinical psychology assessments, the batteries of tests that people do. But we also looked at school performance. And when our kids were about 15, 16 years old, when they were supposed to be passing class 10, we gave them a test that the Tamil Nadu government uses for children in class 8 and found that the bulk of our children couldn't pass that. And there was a very clear dose response. The children who had the most normal growth did best, and the children who had been stunted from an early point in life that had chronic malnutrition did worse. Mother's education, which I had pointed out earlier, was a mitigating factor and stayed a mitigating factor for a very long time. But when you look at these skills that children are expected to acquire, words, numeracy, understanding of problems, and we give them very simple tests that have to do with logic and reasoning, they are not doing well. They are performing years beyond what we expect of development. So this is our society. And with 35% stunting today in our country, what is it that we are doing to ourselves? When we talk about scientific temper, we tend to think that this is something where if we follow a rational pathway, we can solve problems. But we are complicated and we have a really long way to go. So that's the depressing story about how I think about my future. But the optimistic one is, what have I learned in 20 years of working very deeply in communities? Well, I work on vaccines, I work on infectious diseases, and I told you researchers have a top-down approach. But if I sit in the clinic, if I go out into the community, I will frequently, I don't go as often as I used to when I was starting out this research and I was responsible for most everything. But when I go out into the community, I will have children who were part of our original study come up to me. I will have parents of those children come up to me and say, Doctor, you were studying rotavirus. My child was part of the study. Now I have other children who have received the rotavirus vaccine. So we know what your study did. When we talk to our communities, I think we tend to underestimate, even with all the damage, even with the deprivation that they live with, there is no lack of understanding. It is a lack of communication on our part. And as a scientist, in this particular pandemic, which deals with a virus that that other people haven't dealt with before, I think what I realized very early on last year was that there was a lack of communication from scientists about what really mattered. What was this virus? What were the ways that we needed to handle it? What are the interventions and why are we asking people to follow the guidance that is being provided? What is rational? What is irrational? So if in February of last year, I was asked to speak at National Science Day in Vigyan Bhavan, and I spoke about the virus, I spoke about pandemics, I spoke about what I thought was coming. And there were a lot of senior government officials there, ministers there, and pretty much it was a problem that was still being ignored at the end of February. By March, by when we suddenly had the lockdown, I was hopeful because I thought, okay, at least action is being taken and we're going to wind up with a way that we will be better prepared once we come out of the lockdown. I realized very quickly when the lab that I was heading at the time, the institute that I was heading at the time, was completely unable to get any reagents because all flights had been shut down, that preparation was not going to happen with the rapidity that we had hoped, because I don't think people recognized the consequences of what was being done. Decision makers had not recognized what it would mean to have a total lockdown. Now, of course, in hindsight, we have a much clearer view of what the impact of that lockdown was. And the fact that we took a strategy that may have some values in some situations, but applied it without thinking of both the benefits and what was required to maximize those benefits and what was required to minimize the damage that such an activity could result in. Some states supported their communities better than others, and we saw much of what was done to society at the time. Subsequently, what we have seen is a lot of decisions being made where we don't understand the rationale for those decisions. And a lot of the arguments that science and scientists have made have been around the lack of access to data that informs decision making, that provides an evidence base for why decisions are made the way they are made. There has also been activities that seem to go against science, hurried decisions or decisions that are made out of some sense of nationalism or nationalistic pride rather than being informed by the science. And that, to me, is a very serious issue of our leadership. But I think as a society, we need to be responsible as well. What is it that we can do to change the narrative? How do we hold people who do things in ways that are not informed by evidence accountable? We have had certain people that have called out irrational thoughts, inappropriate decisions, called out when politics has driven the agenda much more than science has. How do you increase those numbers? How do you bring everybody along with you when you deal with these kinds of problems in society? I've been, to some extent, disappointed in my scientific colleagues in that people haven't really stepped up and been willing to stand up for science as much. There are groups of scientists that have done a great job in collating data. When if data is not available from the government, I think it was a remarkable example of Indian Jugaad that we had volunteers and scientists that got together and put up websites that were collecting data from newspapers, from state reports, and that has been the major source of information that we have had. Scientists have done that. They have gone out there, and some people have done a lot of effort in organizing webinars. But I think in terms of reaching out to communities on the ground, we have not done enough. And maybe because we are so isolated in our ivory towers, most of us, we don't actually think that it is our responsibility to be communicating around us as well. There are, of course, examples of what will prove me wrong in small settings. But I can tell you that we have started up our research again. We kept up our research during the lockdowns, during everything that was going on. And our field staff who were going to collect samples from so-called containment zones were beaten up by the police. Now, why would an infectious disease make anyone beat up people? It's because we converted what is a health problem into a law and order problem. We didn't communicate enough with the policemen to understand what was important, what was not important. If we look at what is happening now, we've actually built a mistrust that I think may damage public health efforts for a long time to come. If we go into communities and we talk about doing sero surveys or doing sampling to identify infections, there are streets that will not let us in. That will say, if you are testing for COVID, we want nothing to do with you. And these are communities that we have worked with for a while. Now, because we've worked with them, we can spend enough time, we can communicate with them, and ultimately we do manage to get in there, talk to people, explain things. That was a relationship built over decades. The rest of the country does not have the privileges that people in CMC that are seeking to do public health science do. How do we change that? How do we change the narrative about how society views science and scientists? I think we have a lot of responsibility in all of this. We very rarely wind up working as communities. And if we think about our science academies, the intentions are good, but the intentions don't yet translate into practice. I'm certainly hoping that with COVID-19 being a crisis that has affected all of us, that we will use this not so much to describe all the problems we have encountered in the past, but to use our learning from this to think about what kinds of solutions we can come up with in the future. So I will stop there and hand back to Vivek. And
Thank you very much, Dr. Gagandeep. I know that you have to leave for another online presentation, and we hope to have you back after that when we take questions and answers. Dr. Gagandeep talked about, she expressed her disappointment with the scientists standing up for scientific temper sometimes at this very crucial time. Our next speaker, Prabir Purkayastha, is from the field of journalism, and we know that not all of the media, in fact, most of the media has played a rather negative role on this issue, but within India, there has been a section of the media, of which Prabir is part, which has been a frontliner in promoting scientific temper in the context of the COVID pandemic. They have themselves researched and brought to light very important information. They have busted fake data. They have really played perhaps a much more important role than the scientists in addressing the issue of pseudoscience, which is so important while promoting scientific temper. Prabir Purkayastha is a science activist from many, many years. He is an executive committee member of the All India People Science Network. He's also the founder of an online media outfit, NewsClick, which has been in the forefront of presenting the facts at a time when facts have to be presented. And for this, he has also been targeted. He and NewsClick have also been targeted by this government for speaking the truth to their power. I will invite Prabir to share his views with us. Prabir? Prabir, we can't hear you. Can you turn on your mic? No, we can't hear you.
Now?
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Yes, the controls, Vivek, were in your hands. Forced us to unmute us.
Well, you will not be silenced, I assure you.
In spite of technology.
We won't even attempt it, and I'm sure you'll triumph over technology. You're a technologist, par excellence.
Yeah. Well, that will go to the Pegasus zone, so I'm not going there at the moment. Thank you very much, Vivek, for calling me a journalist. I'm basically an engineer, like Gagandeep's father, and I've been so for a very long time, and a science activist. In 2009, I decided that the next generation is turning to video, and if we, as people who are invested in science communication and other communications, do not turn to it, then probably the next generation is something that we will not be able to reach. So that was the genesis of NewsClick and where it is today. Yes, we are targeted purely for the fact that if you speak truth to power, then power will come after truth. So that's not surprising. Coming back to the issues for which you have called me today to speak, that what is the role of communications in this whole issue of fighting COVID-19? And I think Gagandeep made some very important observations, which is that the communications that scientists did perhaps were not good enough at that point of time. Now, that's not surprising. It's not the task of scientists to be also good communicators. Unfortunately, science communication in journalism today is something that doesn't exist. Virtually, very few organizations have a group that does science regularly, science editors. When we started, when we were young, every newspaper had a science section, had a science editor, had science journalists who would cover science. That was something people were interested in. Now, of course, you have fashions, pages after fashions, you have fashion editors, you have fashion journalists. I'm not going to say only about fashion. The whole bunch of things that come in like that. We used to have agriculture was farmers. Now agriculture is about agro-industries. So you can see the shift that is taking place, that the media has changed advertisement as the primary focus, and therefore all the things which make journalism what it should be has been given the go-by. And therefore, there is a bridge between the scientific community and the people, which should have been the journalist community, really is not there anymore. So I think that is also the tragedy that we at the moment see, that it is left to movements like Narendra Dabholkar's movement, like the science movement that Vivek and I are a part of, that it has become our task to carry what was essentially the task for which journalists were also given the responsibility, and which is what the mass media is supposed to do. I think that's something we need to look at. But here, when you talk about the communication not being done properly, the communication not being really what it should be, there is something else that we have to think about, that there is also the role of what I would call active miscommunication. Of course, Gagandeep has also talked about that administrative ways of dealing with a public health problem. That we converted what was essentially a public health issue, essentially something that was a disease, infectious disease which was spreading, for which we had options, we had solutions. Instead of that, what we did was to convert it into essentially a law and order problem, in which just a few government officials were calling all the shots. They were telling us what it was. We have the political leadership, the Prime Minister declaring that COVID would be won in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, if we did a lockdown and we did ghantis at night, at 9 o'clock we switched off electricity. So this kind of approach, instead of treating it as a law and order problem, instead of treating it as a public health problem, treat it as essentially an administrative problem, and then also treat it as a public relations problem. So both were the issue that the government were doing, and they thought that this was an easy one. They had been told that if you do a lockdown for 3 weeks, COVID will go away. So what we did is, of course, for a country of 1.3 billion, we did a lockdown without any preparation, without any planning, and the consequences are there before us. And then we declared victory, not from here. We also declared victory in Davos, where the Prime Minister also declared that India has shown the way to other countries how to fight COVID. And then soon after, we had, of course, what is called now the second wave. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of the waves and so on. And yes, probably we are going to see more. We cannot predict when. As we by now must have realized, this mathematical models of a country of 1.3 billion doesn't work. It works in small areas. It doesn't really work across the country. And you can have a Manipur at the moment, which sees relatively high numbers, say relatively, and you could see Delhi has low numbers. And after 3 months, you could see the reverse, because the infections are localized transmission that take place. But instead of doing that kind of analysis, we were really trying to take what would be called the easy way, believing a total lockdown of the country, irrespective of the consequences, will solve the problem. And of course, transferring the entire problem of the lockdown on the poor, because they are the daily wage workers who had no sustenance. We refused to even let them out of the house, no rations, and we know the consequences of all of that. I'll come to the issue of communications here, that when the communication is only to echo whatever the government is saying, then of course you don't get truth, you don't get credibility, you don't get what you need to do as a society, as people who are living in that society. You do not take them along with you. Instead of that, you're telling them that I know best, I'm God of the country, and I'll tell you what to do. Just follow blindly what I'm saying. It may work 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. At some point it won't. And we have seen now that there's increasing distance between the people and the government, and becomes stark when you have the kind of deaths due to oxygen shortage, no beds in hospital. When all of that becomes stark and the government says everything is fine, then obviously the credibility really goes. And then subsequent steps that you need to take do not carry credibility. But I'll not only talk about the problems of what I would call the failure of the governance model, which has believed that instead of messaging to the people, you should massage the message. That means you should really give people what you think they should believe in, rather than what the reality is in front of them. And you also believe that you can do it because you control all the levers of power, you control the means of communication, and if there are critical people over there, critical organization, you can also discipline them in different ways. Of course, the coercive way is what the two journalists from Manipur have faced. There are other coercive ways which people are facing. If somebody posts that he wants an oxygen cylinder in UP, at one point there is a threat of NSA against him, or at least a sedition charge at the very least. So all of these are instruments to silence people. And therefore, it's also a communication of a certain kind, except the communication is not either scientific or in the interests of the people. But I will also talk about, there is also active miscommunication, which is not just this act of government to try and discipline the people, keep them in line, give them what the government needs to tell them only they should believe and nothing else. But there is also active miscommunication of two different kinds. One is, of course, the belief that there are certain ways of dealing with COVID which are completely unscientific, which have no basis in reality at all. And these are of two kinds. One is very strongly rooted in a certain ideology, which believes that a certain kind of religious identity is what we need to weave in with the people. Therefore, talk about Gomutra, talk about various other things. And coupled with that, now it's also business, where you have a Baba Ramdev talking about coronel with ministers of the BJP government on stage, without talking about what is this coronel that you are talking about. Does it have any value? It's also merchandising. Let's not forget that it is not simply medicine we are talking about. You are talking about something of a multi-billion-dollar empire today, thousands of crores empire today, which is what Baba Ramdev's empire is. So it is really marrying capitalism to a certain kind of ideology that you are also seeing here. So that is one part. The second is, of course, there is this active inculcation that if you can't fight COVID-19, then distract the people by saying Muslims are spreading it. You know, it is all of this is some kind of COVID jihad. These were all the kinds of words that are used. So all kinds of distraction to say the real issue is not a public health issue, it's something else. But that is connected to everything in the country now, which gets taken down this path. Every issue gets converted to an issue of Hindu or Muslim identity. And that's the way a certain set of forces in the country are operating. I don't have to tell you who they are. The last point I would like to make, and that's also important today, that social media is a multiplier. Unfortunately, social media multiplies fake news even more strongly than real news. And there is a reason for it. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of it. Simply put, something which seems to be different and also makes you feel good that you don't have to do much, can get traction. And fake news, this has been shown, has more traction than real news. It is what is called in journalism, if a dog bites a man, it's not news. Nobody wants to know about it. But if a man bites a dog, now that's big news. Okay, so you get that problem of what is news then. Something which is different is news. And therefore you have now an anti-vaccination, what is called the anti-vaxxer campaign. These things were not there in India earlier, that we really had a belief in vaccines because we knew that smallpox is something, we got rid of vaccines. Polio vaccines had no pushback. We believed that, yes, all of this worked. So India actually, the much reviled Indian people who we think are backward and so on, they have taken to science whenever we have given them science which they think has benefited them, including the Green Revolution by our farmers. So that has never been the problem. The problem here is that there is a set of people who are pushing, using social media, are pushing this anti-vaxxer campaign. It is coming from the West where people think it's my solemn right not to wear a mask, not to take vaccines because I believe it to be so. And therefore, just like the right to carry guns, I should also have the right, whether I vaccinate myself or not. It's a part of my individuality. Now, this is not the Indian psyche. But unfortunately, we also have the whole bunch of people who now believe in social media, and they're also willing to amplify this. You'd be surprised to know this whole anti-vaxxer campaign, about 65% of it comes from really on social media in the world, comes from only 12 people. Only 12 people have been multiplied by a whole bunch of other people. They multiply, they see, and they pass it on, share it with their friends. So this kind of social media infection, which is also, of course, there in the hate campaigns that we see, all the hate campaigns we have seen, there is a nucleus who actually populate social media. There's an organized social media in which these things are expressed. But in this particular case, it has been really that a few set of Western figures have been propagating this, blindly picked up here. It is pseudoscience, masquerades as science. Some of them are doctors, some of them are senile, even 1 or 2 Nobel Prize laureates who become senile. And then, of course, this is the prestige. This doctor said this, and of course, thousands of doctors may have said something else, it doesn't matter. So I think all of this today is what you see. To sum up in a very few words, finally what I'm going to say, it is our task, therefore, is to fight all this miscommunication. Miscommunication which comes from the government, disinformation which comes from those who would like to make money out of a public health disaster, those who would like to corner benefits of different kinds from this, and also those who propagate both hate and complete misinformation about what is a public health issue, and say that other kinds of things are there. The scientists are telling us lies, attack science itself, and hope, therefore, whatever their interests are, hope, therefore, that they will get social media mileage. And unfortunately, social media platforms survive on virality, and therefore they are instrumental, their algorithms are instrumental also in spreading this kind of message, because that gets eyeballs and eyeballs get advertising revenue. So I'm going to stop here. And I think, as I said, that people like Kishore and Elendro have shown us the way that what is the task of really of journalists today, what they must do and how they must do it, and take risks while doing it, because you cannot speak, as Vivek talked about, truth to power without consequences, and we should be able to face those consequences provided there are forces in society which support us during this period. So I'll end with this, that we have to also talk about solidarity with those activists who are going to get attacked while doing their task, solemn duty, as laid down by the Constitution, which is spread scientific temper. Thank you very much, Vivek, all of you, for listening to me and giving me this opportunity to speak to you.
Thank you very much, Prabir. You have highlighted that it's not only the corona that goes viral, but also sometimes there is a misinfodemic, where all kinds of fake news and untruths go viral through the whole network of social media. And you've also highlighted that it's our duty as citizens to promote scientific temper, so it is our duty to speak out against this. Now, I will request Dr. Hamid Dabholkar. He will read out the citation by which we will be felicitating our two young colleagues, young as compared to Prabir and myself, our two colleagues from Manipur. They have spoken a simple truth. And the truth is that you cannot fight COVID with gomutra and cow dung. And for this, it's pretty amazing that they were booked, they were arrested. When they were released by the local courts, then they were rearrested under the National Security Act. I could not think of a better example to show how this government is misusing the legislation like the NSA to target individuals who are just doing their constitutional duty. Dr. Dabholkar will read the citation. This being an online meeting, we cannot actually shake hands with our colleagues from Manipur. I will also mention here that on behalf of the Pune Collective and AIPSN, there will be a modest award of 25,000 rupees each to Erendro and to Kishore Chandra as a token of our appreciation. And now I request Dr. Hamid to read the citation and commend our two colleagues from Manipur. Dr. Hamid. We can't hear you.
Yeah, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Now we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, it's really an honor and privilege to read this citation. So I read the citation here. Dear friends, we have gathered here today to felicitate two courageous scientific temper frontliners from Manipur, journalist Kishore Chandra Wangkhem and activist Irnerdo Lichambam, for their sterling role in opposing pseudoscience. As many of you must know, both of them were booked under National Security Act after BJP functionaries complained about their Facebook post, which correctly shared that cow dung and cow urine don't cure COVID-19. A bench of Justice P.V. Sanjay Kumar and Justice K.H. Nobin Singh ordered the release of Mr. Wangkhem after journalist's wife, Ranjita, filed a petition. Ms. Ranjita opposed the arrest under stringent National Security Act. Mr. Lochembam was released by order of Supreme Court bench of Justice D.Y. Chandrachud and Mr. Shah, who observed he cannot be kept in jail even for a day. We would like to salute both of them and their families for their courage to assert scientific temper and, more importantly, stand up and fight for it. It is pertinent to point out here that Article 51A(h) of Indian Constitution stipulates that it is the fundamental duty of every Indian citizen to adhere to scientific temper. Promoting scientific temper, which is a fundamental duty for each one of us, requires us to oppose the promotion of pseudoscience, especially by governmental bodies and elected representatives. Kishore and Ernardo were performing our fundamental duties. They must be commended for this. That the present government sought to punish them shows how far this government and its major constituent party have strayed away from our constitution. While commending Kishore and Erendro, we express our great concern in the regard of encouragement and promotion of fake data, pseudoscience, and irresponsible decisions by the central and some state governments, on the one hand, which have contributed to the spread of pandemic and the neglect of planned response based on scientific policy on the matter. COVID cannot be fought without scientific temper. Fighting COVID requires that all citizens follow scientific COVID protocols. Fighting COVID scientifically requires the reversal of policies promoting private health care for non-profit, leading to neglect and decline of effective public health care system in most of the states of India. Fighting COVID requires effective implementation of a national policy for universal free vaccination on a crash basis. It requires planning based on honest data collection while wasting huge sum of sums in self-advertisement for free vaccination. The central government and several state governments are failing to practice at the ground level to ensure adequate supplies of vaccines, oxygen, and even proper disposal of dead bodies of those who succumb to COVID. Media organizations reporting accurately the situation on the ground are being systematically targeted and sought to be silenced by misuse of state apparatus. Thus, the government itself is promoting fake data and actively trying to suppress the truth. We demand the reversal of privatization policies and restoration of scientific policy for ensuring good quality public health care as universal right. We further demand that the government stops its attack on media reporting honestly on the COVID situation. We also demand that full respect to be shown to our constitutional Article 51A H for actively promoting scientific temper at a mass level in order to effectively combat and defeat the COVID pandemic. We appeal to all citizens, mass organization and educational institutions to undertake programs and activities for promoting scientific temper in these challenging times and to raise our voices against the brutal killing of rationalist frontliners Dabholkar, Pansare, Kalburgi and Lankesh. On behalf of the AIPSN, Pune collective and all of us who are working for scientific temper, many congratulations to Kishore Chandra and Irendro for their courage and efforts in opposing pseudoscience and upholding constitutional values. AIPSN and Pune collective.
Thank you, Dr. Hamid Dabholkar. Dr. Hamid will also speak a little later. This citation, actually, the main text of the citation is part of a statement issued by All India People Science Network, which is circulating throughout the country for signatures. It is there available on the website. And those of you who have not signed this statement, we request you to sign the statement and also share it with your friends so that this message goes out far and wide. Now, we will request our colleagues from Manipur to speak, and they will speak briefly. Each will speak for 5 to 7 minutes. I will first request Brother Kishore Chandra Wankem to say a few words on this occasion. Kishore, please unmute yourself.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, thanks to Pune Collective and All India People Science Network for having us on this very occasion of commemorating Sri Narendra Dabholkar as National Scientific Temper Day. Thank you for the felicitation, and it means a great to both of us. And we look forward to this kind of support, this kind of cooperation from the like-minded people around the across the nation. I'll just talk briefly about my incarceration, because this was my fourth, incarceration by this fascist regime. I have been very critical of this far-right regime since the very beginning, especially when this party came to power in Manipur. I have been now incarcerated 4 times, out of which in 3 of the cases, somewhere or the other, there has been this charges of creating enmity between two groups or between two religious groups, or hurting the sentiment or religious sentiment of the majority. I don't know where this, charges come from, because I was just trying to express my opinion. I belong to a very small ethnic minority here in Manipur. We follow a traditional religion called Sanamahism here in Manipur. Of course, most of us here in Manipur are Hindu, but there are certain people, there are a few peoples who don't believe in Hinduism, and I happen to be one of them. So my only apprehension, and the reason why I have been against this fascism or far-right ideology, is the process of assimilating the minorities, the process of assimilating the culture, the language, and the religion of the minority group like that of mine. The majoritarianism, rule, or the majoritarianism, policy followed by this regime is a threat to the very existence of minority communities like ours. I was charged with sedition twice and under NSA twice. Now, this time, the regime had gone beyond the limit and then booked us, including Irendra and me, under the National Security Act for just expressing the truth that cow dung and cow urine cannot cure COVID-19 in this very lean time. Why I especially expressed that, in my Facebook post was the president of the BJP Manipur unit openly propagate, openly support cow urine and cow dung as a cure to COVID-19. And he even mentioned in one of the discussions that we had that the cow dung and cow urine are being exported to United States for further research, as it has been proven that cow dung and cow urine can cure COVID. That is very irony for us. Now, we are living in a country where a saint openly challenged the medical practice, and the government, the authority, will not do anything against the saint. He openly insult or disregard thousands and thousands of medical practitioners, and thousands of medical practitioners under the aegis of Indian Medical Association even lodged a complaint against the saint, but the government will not do anything. But on the other hand, people like us, who express the truth, reason being, we are of the opinion that this kind of propagation, this kind of ideology being, spread by the far-right regime is a danger for us, is a danger for the future of our generation as well. Now, my last point that I want to make here is that where is the future of this country leading to under this current regime? So I believe that it is the right time to have a platform for all the like-minded people, and then start a movement to make sure that this doesn't overcome upon us, and then we become we become under them. So it is very important that this kind of observance is observed, to make sure that the scientific temperament is being spread to the younger generation, and then we are, of course, out of the danger of the reach of this kind of ideology that is really, really, shocking to learn that this regime is spreading. Now, India became a laughing stock when international media started covering the practice of using cow dung and cow urine as a cure for COVID-19. So it's an embarrassing moment for all the Indians to say. So, I mean, we need to work together and then make sure that this kind of embarrassment, doesn't occur again in this country. And lastly, thank you once again to Pune Collective and All India People's Science Network for having us and for felicitating. And I look forward to have a very supportive role from all the like-minded people across the country. Thank you, everyone, once again.
Thank you, Brother Kishore Chandra. Now we will listen to Brother Kang, who will also speak for 5 to 7 minutes. Brother Erendro.
Thank you very much. My appreciation to all the organizers for organizing such an event. I'm sure we have people listening from all across India and perhaps from abroad as well. I want to keep my remark very brief. You know, when I was in prison for saying that cow dung and cow urine doesn't cure COVID, and that we should be looking at this pandemic from a scientific point of view, that the cure should be science and common sense. Just for saying that, we were arrested unnecessarily. The lower courts released us, but then they were not happy with it. So they slapped NSA and, you know, ended up spending more than 2 months in jail. Now, when I was in jail, I mean, a jail is not a really nice place to be. You know, you have to find time. You have to find something or the other to do to sort of like pass your time. So Manipur jail had a really small library, and I was, you know, just trying to lay my hands on any book which could be, you know, readable. It turns out that they had a good collection of Jawaharlal Nehru's writings, and some of these books were written when he himself was in prison. And so I ended up rereading the Glimpses of World History and Discovery of India. You know, what really struck me is that imagine India gaining independence with one set of founding fathers whose ideas are based on superstition. I'm sorry, I'm having a blackout here, but I'll be quick anyway. Imagine India being founded by a bunch of, you know, founding fathers whose core beliefs are superstition. And imagine an India founded by founding fathers who believed in scientific temper. I believe that today we have a democracy in India precisely because the founding fathers of India promoted scientific temper, and that, you know, scientific temper is, as you know, Brother Vivek mentioned, it's an approach to truth. It's not just a methodology to find truth, but it's an approach. So scientific temper is something which could be a universal value, which could something, it is something that can unite everybody in India. You know, maybe Christianity cannot unite everybody in India, maybe Hinduism cannot, you know, but I believe that if we promote scientific temper, which is consistent with democracy and pluralism and freedom, I think we will have a much better country, a democratic country. And I think it is important, as Professor Kang mentioned in her earlier lecture, that we must stand up, including the scientific community and all of us, you know, Mr. Purkayastha, you gave a very good talk about, you know, how we can, you know, try to dispel some of this misinformation. And this is what we were trying to do here in Manipur, and unnecessarily we were slapped with NSA. So, you know, I think what we can do is, you know, organize very small events and big events like this that the Pune Collective and other organizations have done, so that we build solidarity. And if we are united from all across India, and if we are able to promote scientific temper, then I think I'm very sure there are scientists who are also good communicators. You know, Albert Einstein was a pretty good communicator. He was pretty much a scientist celebrity. And so we need people, you know, in India, scientists for us to promote, so that people listen to them, you know, rather than listen to all this unnecessary superstitious theory about Gau Mutra and cow dung and all this. So thank you very much for reaching out all the way from Pune and other places, all the way to the eastern corridor of India. So really thankful, very glad to join all of you from Manipur. Thank you.
Thank you both Kishore Chandra and Erendro for making a number of very important points. I will refer to some of these points when I speak at the end. Now I will request the colleague who read the citation, felicitating both our colleagues from Manipur. I will request Dr. Hamid Dabholkar to speak. Dr. Hamid is himself a very active and important activist in an organization which is doing wonderful work in promoting scientific temper. That is the Maharashtra Andhashraddha Nirmulan Samiti. This organization has chapters in every district and in every town, many villages, and it is perhaps the foremost organization in Maharashtra which is carrying forward the work of Dr. Narendra Dabholkar. I will request Dr. Hamid to speak. He will speak in Marathi because this is a program which is being hosted by Pune Collective. There are many persons listening, and India is a country which has so many important languages. So he will speak in the language of Maharashtra. Dr. Hamid?
Okay. Before I move on to which will be incomprehensible by Kishore and Ernesto, I will just like to say a few words. It's really in English. It's really an honor and pleasure to be here with you. When Dr. Montero approached me requesting that I should hand over this citation to Kishore and Erendro, my first reaction was that I'm not so courageous actually, who can felicitate these two guys. But yeah, you are doing really fantastic job. And as this is being done on the backdrop of National Scientific Temperament Day, which is observed in memory of martyrdom of my father, late Dr. Narendra Dabholkar, I can say for sure that he would have felt very proud of you for the phenomenal work that you are doing in Manipur and the courage that you showed to choose this path. The work we do at Andhashraddha Nirmulan Samiti, the Committee for Eradication of Blind Faith in Maharashtra, MANS, is built on 3 pillars by Dr. Narendra Dabholkar. One of them is Vigyan, science. The other is morality, niti. What is very important is in between is nirbhayata, is courage. So if we want to reach to a destination of a moral society through use of science, it cannot be achieved without showing courage, nirbhayata. And apart from Kishore and Erendro, NewsClick and Gagandeep ma'am, it's really honor to and Prabir sir, it's really an honor to share this stage with them, because the common thread between all of these participants is the kind of a courage they are showing to talk to the power. Okay, now I will switch to Marathi, and maybe somebody will summarize my speech for your benefit in English. नमस्कार सगळ्यांना. आपण पुणे कलेक्टिव्हच्या प्लॅटफॉर्मवरती बोलत असल्यामुळे मराठीमध्ये बोलण्याचं माझ्यावरती जबाबदारी आहे. सगळ्यात पहिल्यांदा तर मी पुणे कलेक्टिव्ह आणि ऑल इंडिया पीपल सायन्स नेटवर्कचे जे सगळे सहकारी आहेत आपले, त्यांचं मनापासून अभिनंदन करतो, त्यांचे आभार मानतो की त्यांनी इतक्या महत्वाच्या कार्यक्रमामध्ये सहभागी होण्याची आम्हाला सगळ्यांना संधी दिली. आणि सचे पण महाराष्ट्र अंधश्रद्धा निर्मूलन समितीचे कार्यकर्ते देखील या कार्यक्रमामध्ये सहभागी आहेत. बरेच वेळेला ईशान्यपूर्व भारत हा जणू काही भारताचा भागच नाही अशा पद्धतीनं मध्यवर्ती भारतातली पुण्या मुंबई सारख्या दिल्ली सारख्या भागात राहणारी माणसं आम्ही सगळी माणसं मानत असतो. त्या पार्श्वभूमीवरती भारताच्या एका टोकाला ज्यांना अजूनही देखील मध्यवर्ती भारतामध्ये वेगवेगळ्या म्हणजे भारतीय मानलं जात नाही. तुम्ही वाचलं असेल, मीराबाई चानूची पहिली प्रतिक्रिया होती की ऑलिम्पिक पदक जिंकल्यावरतीच पहिल्यांदा आम्हाला अशा स्वरूपाचा सन्मान या देशामध्ये मिळतो, नाही तर बाकीच्या वेळेला आम्हाला चायनीज म्हणून हिणवलं जातं. तर अशा एका कोपऱ्यामध्ये ही माणसं इतकं महत्वाचं काम करतायत आणि त्यांना ज्या गोष्टीसाठी ज्या गुन्ह्यामध्ये त्यांना अटक झालेली आहे, ज्या गुन्ह्यामध्ये त्यांना 2 महिने तुरुंगात काढायला लागले आणि ज्या गुन्ह्यासाठी त्यांच्यावरती राष्ट्रीय सुरक्षेचा भंग केला अशा स्वरूपाचा गंभीर म्हटला जाणारा आरोप लावला जातो. तर असा जर आरोप लावायचं ठरवलं या गुन्ह्यासाठी, तर मला वाटतं मी आणि माझ्या बरोबर काम करणारे अंधश्रद्धा निर्मूलन समितीचे कार्यकर्ते दिवसातून कमीत कमी 4 वेळेला किंवा जास्त वेळेला त्यांना राष्ट्रीय सुरक्षा कायदा लावायला लागेल. कारण की आम्ही गेली 1.5 वर्ष कोविडच्या विषयी ज्या सगळ्या गैरसमज आहेत, ज्या सगळ्या अंधश्रद्धा आहेत, त्याच्याविषयी सातत्याने प्रबोधन करत आलेलो आहे. पण त्यातल्या त्यात बरी गोष्ट मला वाटतं महाराष्ट्राची ही आहे की महाराष्ट्राला एक संत आणि समाज सुधारकांची परंपरा लाभलेली आहे. आज आपल्याला त्यांचं महत्व ज्या वेळेला मणिपूरमध्ये घडणाऱ्या गोष्टी आपण ऐकतो त्यावेळेला लक्षात येते की या राज्यामध्ये तुकाराम, ज्ञानेश्वर, गाडगे महाराज, फुले, आंबेडकर, शाहू महाराज हे सगळे होऊन गेले आणि त्यांना पण त्या कालखंडामध्ये हेच सगळं अनुभवायला लागलं होतं. त्यामुळे ज्या वेळेला सावित्रीबाई रस्त्यावरती उतरल्या महिलांच्या शिक्षणासाठी, खरं तर आज आपल्याला जितकं हास्यास्पद वाटतं की करोनासाठी गोमूत्र आणि शेण वापरण्याचा सल्ला, तितकंच हास्यास्पद कदाचित महिलांना शिक्षण न देण्याचा सल्ला देखील होता, जो काही हजारो वर्ष आपला समाज पाळत आला. आणि त्याच्या विरोधात ज्या वेळेला सत्य सावित्रीबाई आणि ज्योतिबांनी बोललं त्यावेळेला त्यांना देखील हेच सहन करायला लागलेलं. त्यामुळं आपला समाज मला वाटतं अशा स्वरूपाच्या एका मानसिकतेमध्ये कायमच असतो की जे सगळ्यांना पटत असतं, कळत असतं अंतर्मनात, परंतु ते बदलण्यासाठी कोणीतरी पुढाकार घेण्याची गरज लागते. आणि तशा स्वरूपाचा पुढाकार घेणारी ही सगळी माणसं आहेत. भले आपण आज अल्पमतात आहोत आणि सत्य बोलणारी लोक कायमच अल्पमतात राहिलेली आहेत. त्या पार्श्वभूमीवरती अशा सगळ्या लोकांचं या प्लॅटफॉर्मवरती येणं हे खूप महत्वाची बाब आहे असं मला वाटतं. नरेंद्र दाभोळकरांनी वैज्ञानिक दृष्टिकोनाचा प्रचार प्रसार करण्यासाठी जे काम केलं त्याविषयी मी बोलणं अपेक्षित होतं. त्यातल्या 2 किंवा 3 महत्वाच्या गोष्टी मी आपल्या सगळ्यांच्या समोर शेअर करणार आहे, जे मला असं वाटतं की महाराष्ट्राबाहेरच्या आणि जगभरातल्या विज्ञानवादी संघटनांना, रॅशनलिस्ट मुवमेंट्सना समजून घेण्यासारख्या आहेत, त्यांच्यापासून थोड्या वेगळ्या आहेत. महाराष्ट्रातले एक विख्यात साहित्यिक आणि तत्वचिंतक सुरेश द्वादशीवार डॉक्टर दाभोलकर गेल्यानंतर असं म्हटले होते की महाराष्ट्राने अनेक हुतात्मे आजपर्यंत बघितलेले आहेत. कामगार चळवळीसाठी, संयुक्त महाराष्ट्रासाठी, शेतकऱ्यांच्या लढ्यांसाठी, हुतात्मे झालेले अनेक लोक महाराष्ट्राने बघितलेले आहेत. नरेंद्र दाभोळकर हा महाराष्ट्रातला वैज्ञानिक दृष्टिकोनाच्या प्रचार आणि प्रसारासाठी हुतात्मा झालेला पहिला माणूस होता. तर वैज्ञानिक दृष्टिकोन ही किती महत्वाची गोष्ट आहे, सायंटिफिक टेम्परामेंट ही किती महत्वाची गोष्ट आहे, ती पण तितकीच महत्वाची गोष्ट आहे की जिच्यासाठी माणसाने स्वतःचं जीवन पणाला लावावं. ह्या धारणेनी नरेंद्र दाभोळकरांनी त्यांच्या आयुष्यातली उभी 40 वर्ष काम केलं. आणि ज्या वेळेला 40 वर्षापूर्वी त्यांनी हे काम करायला सुरुवात केली, त्यावेळेला सामाजिक क्षेत्रात काम करणारे देखील त्यांचे जे सहकारी होते, त्यांनी त्यांना असं सांगितलं की हे काही काम आहे का? तुम्ही राजकीय काम करा, तुम्ही सामाजिक न्यायाचं काम करा, तुम्ही कुठल्या तरी संघटनेमध्ये जावा. अंधश्रद्धा निर्मूलन आणि सायंटिफिक टेम्परामेंटचा प्रचार प्रसार करणं हे काही काम नाही होऊ शकत. पण त्यांना त्याच्याविषयी विश्वास होता, त्यांना ते महत्वाचं वाटत होतं. आणि आज 40 वर्षानंतर मला वाटतं त्याचं महत्व समाजामध्ये आपल्या सगळ्यांना जाणवतंय. सातत्याने ज्या वेळेला धर्माच्या नावावरती अधर्म पसरवणारं सरकार केंद्रात आणि आमच्या राज्यामध्ये आहे, राज्यात होतं, केंद्रात आहे, तर अशा परिस्थितीवरती लोकांना विज्ञानवादी मनोभूमिका स्वीकारायला उद्युक्त करणं हे किती महत्वाचं काम आहे हे आपल्याला परत परत लक्षात येतंय. कोविड पॅन्डेमिक मुळे त्याचा आपल्या दैनंदिन जीवनाशी, जगण्या मरण्याशी किती जवळचा संबंध आहे हे देखील या निमित्ताने स्पष्ट झालेलं आहे. डॉक्टर दाभोळकरांनी आणि महाराष्ट्र अंधश्रद्धा निर्मूलन समितीने हे काम करताना मला वाटतं की ज्या थोड्याशा वेगळ्या समाजापेक्षा बाकीच्या विज्ञानवादी संघटनांपेक्षा ज्या वेगळ्या भूमिका घेतल्या, त्या 3 भूमिका मी इथे मुद्दामून नमूद करणार आहे. बहुतांश वेळेला विज्ञानाचा ज्या वेळेला आणि वैज्ञानिक दृष्टिकोनाचा प्रचार प्रसार आपण करतो, त्यावेळेला पहिल्यांदा धर्माची चिकित्सा ही आपल्या आड येते. जसं किशोर आणि एर्नेनरोच्या बाबतीत झालं की ते मिसइन्फॉर्मेशन पास ऑन करतायत असं कोणाचं म्हणणं नव्हतं, ते आमच्या धार्मिक भावना दुखावतायत असं लोकांचं म्हणणं होतं. म्हणजे ते जे सांगतायत ते सत्य याच्याविषयी कुणाच्याच मनामध्ये शंका नव्हती, परंतु त्यामुळं आमच्या धार्मिक भावना दुखावतायत आणि यामुळं तुम्ही आमच्या धर्माची चिकित्सा करता आणि तुम्ही आमच्या धर्माची चिकित्सा करता म्हणजे तुम्ही धर्मद्रोही आहात आणि पर्यायाने देशद्रोही आहात, असे हे लॉजिक आहे. तर्कतीर्थ लक्ष्मण शास्त्री असं म्हटलेले होते की समाजातल्या सर्व चिकित्सांची सुरुवात ही धर्मचिकित्सेपासून होते, कारण धर्म हा कित्येक शतके, कित्येक हजारो वर्षे मानवी मनाची धारणा करणारी सगळ्यात महत्वाची संस्था आपल्या इथली राहिलेली आहे. आणि त्यामुळे धर्माची चिकित्सा केल्याशिवाय नुसता विज्ञानाचा प्रचार आणि प्रसार हा एका मर्यादेपलीकडे समाज मनाचा ठाव घेऊ शकत नाही. त्यामुळे अंधश्रद्धा निर्मूलनाच्या कामामध्ये विज्ञानाच्या प्रसार आणि प्रसाराच्या बरोबरच धर्माची विधायक, कृतिशील आणि काल सुसंगत चिकित्सा हे नरेंद्र दाभोळकरांनी महत्वाचं सूत्र ठरवलं होतं. कारण आज आपण बघतो की ज्या ज्या वेळेला वेन वी टॉक अबाउट सायंटिफिक टेम्परामेंट, द फर्स्ट हर्डल दॅट वी नीड टू क्रॉस, वी हॅव टू क्रॉस इज द हर्डल ऑफ ऑर्गनाइज रिलिजन. सो मला वाटतं की हे खूप महत्वाचं आहे की विधायक कृतिशील धर्मचिकित्सा. आता विधायक कृतिशील धर्मचिकित्सा म्हणजे काय, तर इट्स नॉट, भारतातल्या आणि परदेशातल्या बहुतांश विज्ञानवादी एथिस्ट रॅशनॅलिस्ट संघटना असं मानतात की विज्ञानाचा स्वीकार करायचा त्यासाठी आपल्याला देव आणि धर्म नाकारावे लागतात. वी हॅव टू रिजेक्ट रिलिजन अँड गॉड इफ वी वॉन्ट टू ट्रॅव्हल द पाथ ऑफ सायन्स ऑर सायंटिफिक टेम्परामेंट. पण अंधश्रद्धा निर्मूलन समिती असं मानत नाही. अंधश्रद्धा निर्मूलन समिती असं मानते की भारताच्या संविधानाने, राज्यघटनेने आपल्याला जो अधिकार दिलेला आहे की प्रत्येक माणूस त्याचा देव आणि धर्म मानू शकतो, ठरवू शकतो, परंतु सार्वजनिक जीवनामध्ये आपण तो आपला देव आणि धर्म आणू नये. म्हणजे काय, तर मणिपूर मधल्या कुणालाही जर वाटत असेल की काऊ डंग आणि काऊ युरिनमुळं कोविड बरा होतो, तर व्यक्ती म्हणून ते करण्याचा त्यांना पूर्ण अधिकार आहे. त्यांना ते नका करू हे सांगण्याचा देखील आपल्याला पूर्ण अधिकार आहे. या उपर त्यांनी ते जर करायचं ठरवलं तर त्यांना आपण काही थांबवू शकत नाही. परंतु ज्या वेळेला एखादा राजकीय पक्ष म्हणून, एखादा सत्ताधारी पक्ष म्हणून तुम्ही ते करायला लागता, त्यावेळेला अडचण आहे. त्यामुळं पब्लिक पॉलिसी जी आहे, आपल्या स्टेटचा जो रोल आहे तो धर्मनिरपेक्ष आहे. आणि धर्माची चिकित्सा करण्याचा आहे. कारण की विज्ञानाची ज्या वेळेला आपण वैज्ञानिक दृष्टिकोन आपलं कर्तव्य असं म्हणतो, त्यावेळेला स्वाभाविक आहे आपल्या आजूबाजूला घडणाऱ्या प्रत्येक गोष्टीची आपण चिकित्सा करायला पाहिजे. त्यामुळे एकाच बाजूला तुम्ही देव आणि धर्म जरी मानत असला तरी दुसऱ्या बाजूला त्यांची चिकित्सा करणं हे देखील शक्य आहे. त्यामुळे अंधश्रद्धा निर्मूलनासाठी देव आणि धर्म नाकारण्याची गरज नाही, हे आपण सगळ्यांनी पहिल्यांदा समजून घेणं आवश्यक आहे. आपल्या समाजामध्ये जसं महाराष्ट्रामध्ये वारकरी परंपरा आहे, प्रत्येक धर्मामध्ये मानवतावादी आणि चिकित्सावादी प्रवाह आहेत. त्या प्रवाहांशी आपल्याला जोडून घ्यायला पाहिजे. महाराष्ट्रातले एक प्रमुख विचारवंत नरहर कुरुंदकर असं म्हणतात की माझा देवावर आणि धर्मावरती विश्वास नाही, माझ्या आजूबाजूच्या हजारो माणसांचा, लाखो माणसांचा देवावर आणि धर्मावर विश्वास आहे आणि त्यांच्यापासून तुटून त्यांचे प्रबोधन करण्यावरती माझा विश्वास नाही. याचा अर्थ काय आहे की आपल्याला ज्या लोकांना बदलायचंय त्या लोकांची भाषा आपण बोलायला पाहिजे, त्या लोकांच्या भावना आपण समजून घेतल्या पाहिजेत. हे महत्वाची बाब आहे आणि हे करता येऊ शकतं. हे गेल्या 30 वर्षामध्ये अंधश्रद्धा निर्मूलन समितीनं सिद्ध करून दाखवलेलं आहे. जसं की पर्यावरण पूरक गणपती, फटाके मुक्त दिवाळी, पर्यावरण पूरक होळी हे महाराष्ट्रातले प्रमुख सण आहेत. अंधश्रद्धा निर्मूलन समिती असं कधीच म्हटली नाही की तुम्ही गणपती बसवू नका. अंधश्रद्धा निर्मूलन समिती आणि नरेंद्र दाभोळकर असं म्हटले की गणपती बसवणं न बसवणं हा तुमचा वैयक्तिक भाग आहे. आपण आपले सण आणि उत्सव हे अधिक पर्यावरण पूरक करू शकतो का? त्याची चिकित्सा करू शकतो का? प्लॅस्टर ऑफ पॅरिस जर पाण्यामध्ये विरघळत जात नाही आणि त्यामुळे आपलेच स्रोत खराब होतात, तर अशा परिस्थितीमध्ये आपण शाडूची मूर्ती बसवूया. आपण रंग जे असतात, जे केमिकल रंग असतात ते वापरूया नको. जे निर्माल्य असतात त्याचं खत करूया. आणि सुरुवातीला जरी विरोध झाला तरी समाजाने 30 वर्षामध्ये ते स्वीकारलं. आज पुण्यातले प्रमुख मानाचे जे गणपती आहेत ते देखील असं म्हणतात की आम्ही पर्यावरणपूरक गणेशोत्सव करू. एवढंच नाही तर मागच्या वर्षी पुण्यातल्या प्रमुख गणपतींनी एकत्र येऊन असं निवेदन काढलं की आम्ही आमच्या धर्माची चिकित्सा करून पाण्याचं प्रदूषण थांबवलं. आता पुणे महानगरपालिका ही आमची नदी स्वच्छ करून देईल का? म्हणजे जो प्रवास वैज्ञानिक चिकित्सेपासून सुरू झाला, धर्माच्या चिकित्सेपासून सुरू झाला, तो सुजाण नागरिकत्वापर्यंत पोहोचतो. हे आपण लक्षात घेणं आवश्यक आहे आणि त्यामुळं समाजाच्या बरोबर हे करणं हा पहिला महत्वाचा मुद्दा आहे. दुसरा महत्वाचा मुद्दा आहे की तरुण आणि लहान मुलांच्या मध्ये जाणं. वैज्ञानिक दृष्टिकोनाचा प्रचार आणि प्रसार करण्यासाठी अंधश्रद्धा निर्मूलन समिती सातत्याने तरुण आणि लहान मुलांच्या मध्ये जात राहिली आणि नुसतं त्यांना विज्ञान शिकवून अनेक वेळेला फायदा होत नाही, तर त्याबरोबर त्यांना चिकित्सा करायला देखील शिकवायला लागतं. कारण डॉक्टर नरेंद्र दाभोळकर म्हणायचे की आपण विज्ञानाची सृष्टी घेतलेली आहे पण दृष्टी घेतली नाही. माणूस हा असा हुशार प्राणी आहे की तो लवकर पटकन फायद्याचं दिसतं ते घेतो. त्यामुळे विज्ञान शिकून विज्ञानाची सृष्टी लोक पटकन घेतात, पण दृष्टी, विज्ञानाचा दृष्टिकोन हा त्यांना वेगळा शिकवायला लागतो आणि त्यासाठी असंख्य छोटे छोटे उपक्रम अनिसनी राबवले. आणि शेवटचा आणि तिसरा महत्वाचा मुद्दा मला जो सांगायचा आहे तो असा की संघटित धर्माचा इतिहास मानवी समूहाच्या बाबतीत हा जवळजवळ 5000 वर्षाचा आहे आणि विज्ञानाचा आणि वैज्ञानिक दृष्टिकोनाचा इतिहास हा उणापुरा 500 वर्षाचा आहे. त्यामुळे या टप्प्यामध्ये माणूस म्हणून, मानवी मन म्हणून आपण अगदी सुरुवातीच्या भागामध्ये आहोत. जेवढा कालावधी संघटित धर्माला मिळाला तेवढाच कालावधी किंवा त्याच्या अगदी निम्मा कालावधी जरी विज्ञानाला मिळाला तरी विज्ञान नक्की मानवी मनाची त्याच स्वरूपाची पकड घेईल अशा आशेनी, आशावादावरती काम करणारे आपण सगळे लोक आहोत. त्यामुळे डॉक्टर नरेंद्र दाभोळकर म्हणायचे की जो रस्ता मी निवडलेला आहे तो एक न संपणारा प्रवास आहे. या प्रवासाला काही अंत नाही, कारण की यामध्ये सतत स्वतःला तपासणं, स्वतःच्या कुटुंबाला तपासणं, स्वतःच्या धारणांना तपासणं, स्वतःच्या समाज धारणांना तपासणं आणि कालसुसंगत त्याच्यामध्ये बदल करत राहणं हा या प्रवासाचा भाग आहे. आणि ते असं देखील म्हणायचे की मला याची नम्र जाणीव आहे की ज्या क्षेत्रात मी काम करतो त्या क्षेत्रातली लढाई ही काही वर्षांच्या नाही, काही दशकांच्या नाही, तर काही शतकांच्या फूटपट्टीवरती खेळली जाते, मोजली जाते. आणि त्यामुळं ही अशा शतकांची लढाई आहे आणि त्या शतकांच्या लढाईसाठी कंबर कसलेले सगळे वीर आज या कार्यक्रमामध्ये एकत्र आलेले आहेत. त्या सगळ्यांना भेटून त्यांच्याबरोबर स्टेज शेअर करून मला खूप मनाला आनंद आणि समाधान वाटतंय. डॉक्टर नरेंद्र दाभोळकर आज असते तर त्यांना या सगळ्यांचा खूप अभिमान वाटला असता, हे मला थांबण्यापूर्वी मुद्दामून नमूद करावंसं वाटतंय. मराठीतल्या 2 ओळी आहेत या कवितेच्या, ज्या कदाचित ट्रान्सलेट करता येतील का नाही माहित नाही, परंतु या भावना ज्या माझ्या आहेत त्या ओळींसारख्या आहेत. देखणा देहांत जो सागरी सूर्यास्त सा. देखणा म्हणजे कोणचा देहांत चांगला आहे, की जो समुद्रामध्ये बुडणाऱ्या सूर्यासारखा असतो. अग्नीचा पेरून जाई रात्रगर्भी वारसा. म्हणजे जो उद्याच्या येणाऱ्या उषःकालाची दवंडी पेटत असतो, जो उद्याच्या उषःकाल आपल्या गर्भामध्ये वाहत असतो, अशा स्वरूपाचा देहांत हा देखणा आहे. आणि त्या स्वरूपाचा देहांत मिळाला तरी उद्याच्या उषःकालांसाठी अशा स्वरूपाचे कष्ट करण्याची आपल्या सगळ्यांची तयारी आहे. या धारणेने आपण सगळेजण इथे जमलोत. पुणे कलेक्टिव्हनी त्यासाठी एक मंच आपल्याला उपलब्ध करून दिला, म्हणून त्या सगळ्यांचे मी मनापासून आभार मानतो आणि थांबतो.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hamid Dabholkar. I will briefly translate into English some of the points that Dr. Dabholkar has raised. He said firstly that if Dr. Narendra Dabholkar were alive today, he would have really appreciated a program like this. And he welcomed our colleagues from the Northeast, who, he said, Northeast tends to be a region of our country which is neglected, which is not sufficiently recognized. And we are very happy to have 2 colleagues who have worked for Scientific Temper in our program today from the Northeast. He said, well, if they were arrested for saying that something as simple as criticizing cow dung and cow urine as a cure for COVID, then he himself and his colleagues in Mans would probably have to be arrested 4 times a day, because this is the kind of things that we are doing on a wide scale. He referred to the traditions of Maharashtra, of the long traditions of reform, of humanism, of a critical view of religion, which are associated with the names of Tukaram, or more recently Mahatma Jyotiba Phule, Savitribai Phule. And he said that when Dr. Narendra Dabholkar started his work, he also had to face questions like, why are you leaving your medical practice to spend your time on this kind of science communication, hydrological work? And now we realize the importance of the work that he was doing. Then he turned to the attitude of the Maharashtra Andhashraddha Nirmulan Samiti on the question of religion. Very often, the first line of attack of the conservatives and of the establishment is that what you're doing is against religion, and by implication, it is against the country. It's anti-religion, so it's anti-national. But what Mans has been saying systematically is that we have to work on 3 principles. The first is the principle of being scientific. The second is the principle of looking critically at our traditions, including religion. And the third is of being fearless. The aspect of science has to be linked up with the aspect of niti, of our ethical questions facing us today. And it's by looking at these things together that we will be taking forward the legacy of Dr. Narendra Dabholkar. Religion, according to Mans, is a private affair. It is only when it enters the sphere of public policy and there is a violation of the secular character of our constitution. If somebody wants to individually believe in COVID being cured by cow dung in cow urine, that's his personal choice. But when a functionary of the government starts making such statements, then it is a problem and that has to be criticized. He also talked about the rich tradition of Maharashtra, the Warkari tradition, which is a religious tradition, but it is the source of a lot of the humanistic tendencies in our Maharashtrian culture. And therefore, Mans is raising questions about, for example, observing festivals like Ganpati in a more ecologically sustainable way, replacing plaster of Paris with images, with statues that dissolve in water by using. So these are the kind of issues. And finally, he said that this journey that on which we are, all of us are embarking, is a long journey. It's an unending journey. And it's a struggle of decades. And he expressed his satisfaction of being part of such a people from all parts of the country who are all on the same journey. Finally, he concluded with a poem from Marathi. I will not try to translate it because it's very difficult to translate poetry. But the gist of that poetry is that a death which leads to a dawn, like the setting of the sun is followed by a dawn, that is the kind of dehant which will take us forward and which we can accept. And he expressed his thanks to the organizers for giving him an opportunity to put these views before all of us. Okay, so I think now we have concluded the program of the main speakers. And now I will go to the question and answer session. A few questions have come in, which I will read out. I think Dr. Gagandeep Kang is back with us. Welcome back. So these questions can be answered by any of the speakers who have spoken so far. Let me begin with a question which I think Dr. Gagandeep will respond to. The question is, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. It's a question about the third wave. And there are concerns that a third wave may be possible. Would you say a few words about this?
From speaking to colleagues in different parts of the country, including in Pune and Mumbai, there are concerns that hospitals have begun to see a small uptick in cases over the last few days, and there is a worry about whether that is the third wave. There is also particular concern that many of the people who are coming in now are people who are vaccinated and are healthcare workers. I think if we look at the data that is coming out of sequencing information, most of what we have is still the Delta variant. And if we look at the serological surveys, 2/3 of the country has already been infected or vaccinated, and that number increases every day. So if we look at the behavior of individuals and we look at communities, I think what we are going to see is flare-ups and not forest fires that burn down acres and acres of wilderness. So, and those flare-ups will be local rises in cases, will be related to events, related to people's behaviors, and will not reach the size that we saw in the second wave unless we have a new variant. If we have a new variant, all bets are off. So I think the third wave is going to be sand dunes rather than mountains.
Okay, thank you, Gagandeep ji. Another question which has come is about the role of the workers who are working in the field of science, which is including the health workers, the doctors, the ASHA workers. So there is a number of so-called science workers. Question is, can we call them as Vigyan Doot? Can we give them a recognition as Vigyan Doot? I will ask Prabir, who himself is from the science movement, to give some comments about the role of those workers in the field of COVID, the fight against COVID, who come from the field of science.
You know, I would say that giving a name is really a small part. Recognition is something much more important. And what we have done is, those who are our frontline social health workers, the ASHA workers, those who take a lot of these issues right down to the people, are also the most exploited and also the least paid and also have the least support. Now, I think we need to bring that out and see how that changes. And if giving a name helps, it's all right. But my problem is giving names is what, as you know, our Prime Minister is very fond of doing. For everything, he has a name. Of course, it starts with the PM of being the first two letters of the name. So I am not so great a fan of naming as a way of doing things. But I think the real issue is how, as a science movement, we can really link up with the health workers, hospitals, to the primary health workers, all of that. I think that's a very real issue. And how do we support them? Because they are fighting the battle today.
Thank you, Prabir. The next question which we will take up is how to counter the anti-vaccine agenda and the fake narratives. Prabir, would you also like to briefly comment about this?
Well, I think that's everybody's challenge, not just us alone. I think the problem that we have is that irrationality is not driven out by rational arguments. If somebody believes in an irrational framework, then whatever you say, he is not going to get convinced. The real battle is over the people who are exposed to both, are not convinced of either at the moment. How do we win them over? And there are two things. One is that, I believe that rationality and love against hatred and unreason take time. The immediate instinct is to hate or fear. These are much more powerful immediate instincts. But if you want to win people over for a longer time, then I think it is also something that you have to work for much longer, because that is the real, that's really when you win people. But I do believe that hatred and all of this unreason, which is really coming from social fear of the unknown, and that has a transient impact. And if we can stand firm and we can propagate what we are saying rationally, I think, yes, we will win. But it's not going to be easy. And let's be facing it. If we are talking to an anti-vaxxer, it's a lost cause. Don't even go there. Don't, what we say in the internet terminology, don't feed the troll. Work on people who are outside that. Work on your messaging. Work on visuals, animation, graphics, the scientific communication we need to do, the positive communication, and not engage with them, because whatever you do, that won't win the argument. They're already convinced of the unreasonable framework which they believe in.
Thank you, Prabir. There are two questions which I think Dr. Gagandeep will have to answer. The two questions are, is it possible for a human being to create a virus? As such allegations are being made against China. Another question which is related to this is this a man-made virus, and how many mutations are expected? Due to vaccine, can mutations be triggered? What are your views on that?
Unmute her. Somebody needs to unmute her.
Thank you, Prabir. So I did answer the question in the chat. Yes, it is possible to create a virus in a lab. And in fact, the polio virus has been made completely from chemicals in a laboratory and shown to be capable of replication. Poliovirus is another RNA virus, but it is somewhat less complicated than SARS-CoV-2 that has multiple layers. And in fact, SARS-CoV-2 is a very unusual virus because it's kind of at the limits of how big an RNA virus can be. So it's much more complicated. I think we are not at the stage where we could entirely create a SARS-CoV-2 virus in the lab. But it is possible that this is a virus that has been modified to become the SARS-CoV-2 virus. We know that there are lots of coronaviruses in animals and humans. It's possible that some of these could have been modified to make SARS-CoV-2. Is there any evidence that the possible has become true? No, there's no evidence of that. So all the questions about what China has done in terms of modification, in terms of lab leaks, there is no evidence for any of this. And in terms of the question of mutations and how many mutations, all RNA viruses mutate quite frequently. SARS-CoV-2 among the RNA viruses is actually quite a stable virus. The original version of the virus was throwing up one mutation every couple of weeks. And for an RNA virus that is replicating at a very high level, that's a very slow rate of mutations. But remember that the SARS-CoV-2 virus has 30,000 base pairs. And if each of those base pairs can be mutated, and you have 4 choices for those mutations, the number of combinations that you have is actually in the trillions. Now, you will not get a trillion different SARS-CoV-2 viruses because that would change what SARS-CoV-2 is. So which are the mutations that matter? The mutations that matter for human beings are mutations that would allow change in our ability to detect the virus so that the tests we have don't work anymore. The mutations that matter would allow the virus to infect us better. And we think we have proof of that because we are seeing better binding to the ACE2 receptor with the mutated viruses that are now called the alpha variant, and to some extent the delta variant. Okay, so we have better binding that's produced by a mutation in the spike protein. We could have immune escape. We could have drug escape. And all of these will matter to us. And those mutations can happen only in a limited number of locations. So is the ability of the virus to mutate infinite? No, it's not. Are we at the limits of what we can see with this virus in terms of mutations that change its characteristics? We don't know. All we can do is keep looking. And in the lab, there are a lot of very interesting experiments that are trying to force mutations to happen. And that will give us some understanding of how much mutation we could expect to see in nature.
Only thing is, if it leaks, we could be in trouble, right?
From what leaks in the labs that are experimenting with all of this, yeah, obviously. But all labs, the first thing we train people on is safety. So you would need to be both careless and irresponsible and malignant.
And a change which is dangerous, which is all this combination put together is very, very unlikely.
Yeah.
Okay. The next question I will ask Dr. Hamid Dabholkar to respond to. It's about public health. It says it's high time to demand public health for all. Private sector is making a huge profit from all this. What is your opinion on that? Dr. Hamid, would you respond to that? Okay, I think he may not be there right now.
He may need to be unmuted as well.
No, I don't see him. I don't see his camera also.
No, he's here.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah,
okay.
Now I'm. No, I completely endorse. There is a great need for strengthening public health in our country. I won't say that private health system doesn't have any role. I think in current scenario, we have a very huge private setup and very minimal and ineffective public setup. So at least the balance needs to be changed, and that's the only way. And I don't know if we are not learning from COVID pandemic mismanagement about public health system, then when we are going to learn about it. Means this could have been the best possible scenario where the citizens of this country could have demanded for a better public health system. But I think everybody has almost forgotten what has happened in the second wave. So if we are not asking our elected representatives for a better public health, then I don't know why they will provide it to us. So it's a very complicated question and a bit frustrating also.
Thank you, Dr. Hamid. From the questions that have been sent to me by the organizers, I think I've covered all the questions except one. And I'll read that question. That is from Dr. Ravindra Banyal. He says, the relationship between science, scientific temperament, and democracy has not been explored in great detail. How can scientific outlook create more informed citizens and strengthen the democratic institutions? So I'll request each of the speakers here to speak for a couple of minutes on this. First, Gagandeep ji, will you respond to this? Shall I repeat?
No, it's fine. It's fine. So going back to stories again, one of the things that really bothers me about science education as we practice it is the fact that everything in education becomes a commodity, and I don't necessarily have a solution for that. So take the example of the CBSE and other systems trying to create, what are they called? HOTS. My children fortunately are too old for this. Higher order thinking skills. And you're supposed to do projects. And then I hear that in every market, there is the opportunity to buy science projects that you can then take to school instead of doing things yourself. So why have we come up with a society where the path is not to do things the right way, but success is defined by your opportunities to take shortcuts, your ability to do things in what I guess people must be viewing as an efficient manner, but doesn't really result in learning. I think the way we think about education has to change a lot. And we do very well with experiments, small scale, little things that a group does well and we laud it. And then it does not change society as a whole. So that's something that I think needs to change. But I'd really like to take 2 minutes to answer the questions Hamid asked me, which are 3 things that we should have done better with the pandemic.
Yeah,
I
please.
think the first thing is about universal healthcare and public healthcare systems. I think the examples of states that have stronger health systems and how they have handled the pandemic is an excellent example of what we need to be looking at for resilience. So Kerala, of course, is an example by itself, but if you look at Tamil Nadu or Maharashtra, you look at states that have done reasonably. Maharashtra is a very large state, so you can't treat it as all one, but there are places that have done exceptionally well when they have focused on their ability to deliver on what constitutes really healthcare as close to the people as you can get it. And I think that's something that needs to apply to healthcare, that needs to apply to education as well. So I think strengthening health systems is critical for the future, and we should have thought about it before the fact, but I hope we will after the fact. The second thing is data and transparency. There just hasn't been data. I referred to this earlier. And I think if we are to think about what we could have done better, we could have collected data better. We stopped private labs from testing for the first almost 2 months. After tests became available at NIV, people were not allowed to test. But it opened up in the middle of the pandemic, so that was pretty useless. But we've done a lot of this, make the decision first and face the consequences later for many of the actions, and many of them have been driven by the desire to control the data, to control what is released and the narrative. I still have not figured out what value this famous number, which is called recovery rate, really means. I mean, if you can explain the value of that to me, I will be better informed. But so far, no one has given me a rational solution. The third one is, we need trust. And we don't have that. We don't have trust in our institutions. We don't have trust. The government doesn't trust us. It doesn't trust private healthcare. It doesn't trust science. It doesn't trust society. And we don't trust the government because we've had bad experiences of it. So how do we create a society where there is transparency and trust? If we'd had that, if the government had focused on those, we might have done a better job. So thank you very much.
Thanks, ma'am. Thanks.
Vivek, you are now muted.
Yeah. Pradeep, would you like to briefly comment on Dr. Banya's statement?
Well, I think that calls for a different seminar again. So I'm going to take a very short response to that and not elaborate on what is really required. I think this relationship between scientific temper and democracy is a much wider question. And that really relates to how you look at a society and how does society build how do we build a society which everybody has stake in? Not a section of the people, not those who are rich, not those who are privileged, but how do you build a society in which everybody has some stake? I think that is a challenge, and that's a challenge of democracy. And yes, science will not get us there, but let's be very clear, we will not get there without science. So a lot of people who say scientists think there is a solution to, there's a scientific fix to every solution, technical fix to every problem. Yes, they're right. But let's be also clear that no social fix will work without science and technology to accompany it. And I think that's the belief that the science movement has, that they have to go together. Vivek, back to you. And unmute. Again, you're muted. You're again muted, Vivek.
Dr. Hamid, will you also?
Yeah, very briefly, this is very pertinent question and very close to the my heart also, and the work MANS does. What is very reassuring, what I have started hearing in last couple of years, is this question. Now, most of our debates in the social political sphere were restricted to capitalism, market economy, socialism, communism, which is very important, I must say. At the same time, I think with this COVID pandemic, it has started bringing science, rationality on forefront. And personally, I believe it has to be at the basic foundation of any citizenship. So I completely agree that there is a huge need for a separate body of work which can link science, scientific temperament, and citizenship, which is like Prabir sir said, it's better done than said. It's a very challenging task, and I think the coming generations, there will be people who will like to dedicate themselves to this kind of cause. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hamid. I think now we'll take the last question, that is for Prabir. Would he comment on the role of the Godi media in the pandemic?
Well, I think the person who has asked the question has framed it quite properly. Once you call it the Godi, so we have the strange spectacle of a section of the media who today parrot what the government says is only one part, are even worse because they attack those who question the government. So if you question the government, you're anti-national, etc., etc. I can understand the social media trolls saying it. But when media organizations do that, and when they become the trolls for the government itself, or they systematically, they're called leaks, they're not really leaks. They're really planted stories. They amplify that. That is, of course, something which we have to fight in the media and US people. But I'm not too worried on that count, because if the government loses credibility, all this will not recover that credibility. And unfortunately for the government, they need to lose credibility once, and then recovery is much more difficult. To build credibility takes time. Lose it, very little. And I think that's where the government has got itself now, particularly the COVID-19, hiding deaths, hiding oxygen deaths, hiding the fact that there is a crisis, declaring victory. All of that hasn't really helped them. So I think the Gauri media also has its task cut out there.
Thank you, Prabir. Now we will end the question and answer session here, and I will conclude with a few comments. But before that, there is an invitation to Kishore Chandra and Narendra from Pune Collective. The invitation is that your participation in this session has been too brief, and Pune Collective would like to invite you again, both of you, where you will be given more time to speak at length on some of the issues that you have raised. I would like to briefly touch on 3 issues in conclusion. The first is the issue of democracy and scientific temper, which Ravindra Banyal has raised, and all the speakers here have given their comments. And yes, scientific temper, which is based on the method of science, and NSTD, which has the slogan behind me, ask why. The opportunity and the space to ask why is very important for scientific temper. So scientific temper needs democracy. And on the other hand, since scientific temper will not stay silent, even if it is not given that space, scientific temper has an important role and is playing an important role in questioning the anti-democratic political onslaughts that are taking place in our country today. And therefore, scientific temper is playing and will play a very important role in strengthening democracy now and in the days to come. It has played a role also. In particular, the role of the journalists, and I would like to hear mention specifically a recent piece of research by 3 journalists. Their names are I'll just have to read those out. Shri Ganesh Jalihal, Tapasya, and Nitin Sethi. These are 3 journalists who have done a very important piece of scientific research. What they have done is to go to the municipalities in Gujarat, and out of 68 municipalities, they collected the data by examining the original documents of the total mortality in those municipalities and computed the number of excess deaths during the period of COVID. Very well-documented numbers, municipality by municipality, and they have come to the conclusion that the number of excess deaths in these 68 municipalities works out to approximately a 65 to 70% increase in the normal mortality in non-COVID times. Okay, so that's an almost doubling of the death rate due to COVID, an increase of 65 to 70%. And on that basis, they have computed that the actual, if you apply the same ratios to the other municipalities and also then to the rural areas, they have computed that the actual number of deaths due to COVID in Gujarat during the in the last several months, in the last COVID pandemic period, is around 2.8 lakhs. And it is 10 times the figure of COVID deaths, which is reported by the government and which is reported on all the websites. A similar exercise was done by me by asking the workers in my union to get me data from the panchayats where they come from about the number of deaths which occurred in 2018, 2019, 2020, and 2021. And we arrive at similar figures there also, that around a 65 to 70% increase in the death rate because of COVID. In a state like Uttar Pradesh, this translates to a figure of around 10 lakh additional deaths, excess deaths. Now, in this context, I think this is perhaps the most important, it is certainly a very important piece of data. Perhaps it is the most important question facing us today, the kind of questions that we could be raising. And I think we have to be proud of the fact that it is journalists who have raised this very important scientific question, a question which can be answered fairly reliably based on the data which is already available. There are many questions which also can be asked about public policy, like the vaccination policy, about the dates when orders were placed for vaccines, about the prices that vaccines were available to the government initially, and what are the prices at which now the private parties have to purchase the vaccines. There are many questions of public policy which can be raised and need to be raised. And these are questions which the scientific temper movement, since scientific temper is concerned about asking the important questions in all these areas, this is something that the scientific temper movement will have to take up in the days to come. What Dr. Dabholkar mentioned in conclusion is that this is a long struggle. It is work that is going on. And since COVID also is here to stay for at least several more months, this work of asking the important questions and using the concern that people have about how to combat COVID to also talk about scientific temper. This is something that the work which will have to be continued in the days and months and the year to come. So NSTD is not just a one-day event. NSTD, National Scientific Temper Day this year, because of COVID, is a work which has just begun, which will have to continue, which will have to intensify in the coming days. And since the COVID pandemic is just one of the pandemics that we are facing, along with that is the misinformation pandemic. There is a educational pandemic, crisis in education as a result of the COVID pandemic. There is an economic pandemic, a crisis in the economy which has been accelerated by the COVID pandemic, but is actually there from earlier. So all these questions are areas where scientific temper will have to play a leading role in raising the right questions and posing the right questions. And I would like to thank all the three speakers and our two colleagues from Manipur for making very, very valuable contributions to the discussion on this issue. In conclusion, I would like to highlight a point raised by colleague Narendra, where he said that in the coming period, scientific temper is something that is needed to hold this country together. A very important point, a very new point, something to think about. Thank you, Narendra, for raising this very important point. And since we're talking about the role of combating a virus by boosting the immunity through vaccinations and through our own systems, I think scientific temper also can play the role of an antibody against the misinformation pandemic, the misinformation virus that is spreading in many mutations all over society. But yes, scientific temper has that power to contest and to arrest the growth of misinformation. So let us also, scientific temper maybe cannot become viral like, COVID has, but it can be a vaccination campaign. And that's when all of us work together to put scientific temper into society in various ways. That can generally raise the temper of society, the scientific temper of society. Maybe we can reach herd mentality or herd immunity when we raise the level of scientific temper sufficiently in society. So with this prospect and with this challenge, I think it is time to conclude. Once again, thank you all the participants. Thank you Pune Collective and all the colleagues who are working on the technical team, Sahil and his colleagues, Ananya, everybody who put this together. And I think it's time to conclude now. We have a lot of work ahead. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.